My uncle declared at the will reading, "As the oldest, I get everything. That's how it's always been." The lawyer smirked and replied, "Well, this isn't the 1800s. My uncle laughed. "That's ridiculous." The lawyer slid a document across the table. My uncle read the first line, and his hands started shaking. "Wait, this can't be real." My father whispered, "Oh, it's real. And it means you get nothing. My family has always been a mess when it comes to money. You know those families where one person thinks they're royalty and the rest of us are just peasants in their kingdom? That's my uncle, Richard. He's always been insufferable, convinced that as the eldest, he was destined to inherit everything. For context, my grandfather was a hardworking man who built his wealth from the ground up. He owned a chain of small but successful hotels in and around Boston, Massachusetts. Nothing mega rich, but enough to live a very comfortable life. When he passed away, we all knew a storm was coming. The family gathered at my grandfather's lawyer's office, a respectable firm in Beacon Hill, for the will reading. My uncle Richard strolled in like he owned the place, a smug grin on his face. "As the oldest, I get everything. That's how it's always been," he declared before the lawyer even started. My dad, his younger brother, just shook his head. "It's 2023, Richard, not the 1800s. That's not how wills work." The lawyer gave him a tight-lipped smirk and slid a thick envelope across the table. "Well, Richard," the lawyer said, "your father had a very different idea." Richard barely glanced at it before chuckling. "That's ridiculous." Then, he read the first line. His face turned pale. His hands started shaking. "Wait, this can't be real." My father leaned in and whispered, "Oh, it's real. And it means you get nothing." Turns out, Grandpa knew what Richard was like. He had been making moves behind the scenes for years. He sold the hotels. Every single one. And instead of keeping the money in one place where Richard could try to contest it, he had done the following. Set up a series of trusts, each one tied to different family members, ensuring long-term financial stability for everyone except Richard. Left a huge chunk to charity, specifically local homeless shelters in Boston. Made sure my father inherited the family home, so Richard couldn't claim any part of it. Set aside a special gift for Richard, just to rub salt in the wound. That gift? A framed copy of an old letter Richard had written as a teenager, complaining that he would never need Grandpa's money. The meltdown, Richard lost it. He started screaming at the lawyer, accusing him of forging documents. He even threatened to sue, but the will had been triple-checked, notarized, and prepared by one of the top estate attorneys in Massachusetts. He had zero ground to stand on. "Dad wouldn't do this to me. I'm the eldest." The lawyer just sighed and handed him another letter. This one was from Grandpa himself, written shortly before he passed. "Richard, being my son does not entitle you to wealth you did not earn. Your greed has blinded you to the love of family. You have spent years assuming you were owed everything. Now, you have exactly what you deserve, nothing." Richard's mouth just opened and closed like a fish. No words. No argument. Just pure shock. Richard had lived his whole life banking on this inheritance. He never saved, never worked hard, never invested. He had credit card debt up to his ears and was leasing a house way beyond his means. With no inheritance, no assets, and no legal standing, he was completely screwed. Over the next few months, his house was foreclosed. His car was repossessed. He tried to sue the family, but the court laughed him out of the room. And, in the ultimate twist of fate, he had to get a job. The man who spent decades looking down on working-class people was now stocking shelves at a supermarket. Meanwhile, the rest of us? We honored Grandpa's wishes. We helped the charities he cared about. We invested wisely, and we carried on his legacy, with none of Richard's toxicity. To this day, Richard refuses to speak to us. And you know what? Good riddance. After the will reading, Richard vanished for a while. No phone calls, no angry texts, just pure radio silence. We all assumed he was off licking his wounds, trying to figure out his next move. We were wrong. 2 weeks later, my father got an official-looking letter in the mail. Richard was contesting the will. "Unbelievable," my dad muttered as he read through it. "He's claiming Dad wasn't in his right mind when he signed the documents." I nearly choked on my coffee. Grandpa was sharp as a tack until the very end. "Doesn't matter," my dad said, rubbing his temples. "If Richard drags this to court, it could tie everything up for years." And that was exactly his plan. If he couldn't get the inheritance, he would make sure no one else could enjoy it either. Richard hired a cut-rate lawyer, the kind you find on late-night TV commercials. He filed the lawsuit in Suffolk County Probate Court, claiming Grandpa had been manipulated, that Dad had somehow tricked him into selling the businesses and setting up the trusts. It was laughable, but here's the thing about lawsuits. Even stupid ones cost time and money. And Richard knew that. Our lawyer, thankfully, one of the best in Boston, assured us that Richard had no case. "It'll get thrown out," she said confidently. "The will is airtight." But Richard had nothing to lose. We did. Over the next few months, the legal battle began to bleed us dry. Filing motions, responding to nonsense claims, it all added up. And then, Richard made his big move. Out of nowhere, our cousin Daniel switched sides. Daniel was Richard's younger brother, and for most of his life, he'd been the quiet one. Always in the background, never making waves. But now? Now he was backing Richard's claims, saying he had doubts about Grandpa's mental state before he passed. My dad was crushed. I thought Daniel was better than this, he muttered. I wasn't surprised. Daniel had always been spineless, letting Richard push him around. With Daniel on his side, Richard now had a witness. Someone inside the family who could cast doubt on the will. It was all a lie, but courts love drama. And suddenly, we had a real fight on our hands. At this point, I was beyond furious. Richard was ruining everything Grandpa built, just because he didn't get his way. I decided to do some digging. If Richard wanted war, he'd get one. I started looking into his finances, public records, past business dealings, anything I could find. And that's when I discovered something huge. Richard had taken out massive loans using Grandpa's name. It was all there, buried in the records. Old bank documents, shady paperwork. Hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled into failed investments, expensive vacations, and, get this, a freaking luxury yacht rental in Miami. The best part? Grandpa had never approved any of it. Richard had forged a signature. I nearly dropped my phone when I pieced it together. Richard wasn't just greedy. He was a criminal. I looked at my dad. We have him. His eyes darkened. Let's bury him. Armed with the evidence of fraud, we went straight to our lawyer. She nearly jumped out of her seat when she saw the documents. This changes everything, she said. Forget the will dispute. This is a felony. We had the forged loan documents, the fake signatures, and bank statements showing where the money had gone. And the best part? One of the banks had security footage. There he was, plain as day, signing documents he had no legal right to sign. He even had the audacity to bring his girlfriend along, a much younger woman who looked bored out of her mind while he played big shot. We had him, but we had to be smart. If we took this to the police right away, he'd panic and try to cover his tracks. So we waited, building our case in secret. Meanwhile, Richard was still convinced he had the upper hand. He had no idea we were about to flip the script. A few weeks later, Daniel showed up at our house unannounced. He looked nervous, shifting on his feet like a kid caught stealing. I made a mistake, he blurted out. No kidding. He confessed that Richard had bribed him into backing the lawsuit. Promised him a cut of the inheritance if they won. But Daniel, being the idiot he was, didn't realize that Richard had no power to give him anything. So let me guess, I said. Richard hasn't paid you, and now you're panicking. Daniel nodded. He said he just needs more time, but I don't trust him. My dad shook his head. And why should we trust you? Then Daniel dropped a bombshell. He has another will. Silence. What? Daniel swallowed hard. Richard, he had someone forge a fake will. One where everything does go to him. He was planning to switch it out and destroy the real one. I nearly lost it. You're telling me this now? Daniel put his hands up. I didn't think he'd actually go through with it. But he's getting desperate. He said if the lawsuit doesn't work, he'll make sure the courts believe his version. We kept our cool, but inside, I was raging. Richard was willing to commit outright fraud to steal from the family. But now, we had the perfect chance to destroy him. My dad looked Daniel in the eye. You want to fix this? Help us set him up. The plan was simple. We let Daniel pretend to still be on Richard's side. He told Richard that we were starting to crack under the legal pressure, and that if they pushed a little harder, we might settle. That's when Richard made his move. He arranged a secret meeting with a shady lawyer, some guy who specialized in, let's say, creative document handling. He was planning to swap out the real will for the fake one and destroy all evidence of the legitimate will. What Richard didn't know, the entire conversation was being recorded. Daniel wore a wire. Our private investigator got video footage of the meeting. And as soon as Richard handed over the forged will, the cops walked in. The moment the officers slapped the cuffs on Richard's wrist was glorious. He screamed, he cursed, he actually tried to run. But where was he gonna go? The parking lot? The charges? Fraud, forgery, identity theft, and attempted grand larceny. And the kicker? Since he had bribed Daniel, Daniel cut a deal with the DA in exchange for a full confession. Richard was done. Just when we thought we'd wiped our hands clean of Richard, something even worse came to light. Remember those shady loans Richard took out under Grandpa's name? Turns out, he wasn't just scamming family. He had racked up debt with the wrong people. And now, they were coming to collect. Richard was in jail, facing a mountain of legal trouble. We thought that was the end of it. But we were wrong. A week after his arrest, a man showed up at my father's house. He was tall, built like a bulldozer, and had a scar running from his eyebrow to his jawline. He didn't introduce himself, just handed over a thick folder. This is your brother's debt, he said, voice low and even. And I don't care that he's locked up. Somebody's paying. My father opened the folder. Inside were loan contracts, bank statements, and threats signed with initials instead of names. This wasn't just some credit card debt. Richard had borrowed from Boston loan sharks. The interest alone was hundreds of thousands of dollars. And now they were looking at us to pay up. I stepped in front of my dad. You think we're going to cover for him? I asked. The man didn't blink. I think you're his blood. And blood handles blood's messes. I clenched my jaw. Not this time. The man sighed. Then, calmly, he pulled out his phone and played an audio recording. Richard's voice crackled through the speaker. Yeah, I know I'm behind, but listen, my family's got money. Just give me a little time, and I'll get them to cover it. They don't even know yet, but they'll cave. Trust me. They always do. I felt physically sick. Even from behind bars, Richard was gambling with our lives. The man pocketed his phone. 2 weeks, he said. Or we collect another way. And just like that, he walked out. We had no intention of paying a dime. We went straight to our lawyer, who brought in law enforcement. The debts were technically illegal, so the police got involved. But while we were dealing with that, something even worse happened. Daniel, our spineless cousin, started helping Richard again. He began moving money around, trying to pay off Richard's debts behind our backs. When we confronted him, he cracked immediately. He stammered. I felt bad for him. He's still family. I saw red. Family? I shouted. After everything he's done? Daniel looked down. He's my brother. No, I said, shaking my head. He's a parasite. And you're letting him use you again. My father, usually the calm one, slammed his fist on the table. You're a fool, Daniel. And if you keep this up, you're going to be in just as much trouble as he is. Daniel just stood there, looking like a lost child. That was the last time we saw him. A week later, he left Boston without a word. Richard finally faced trial. By then, the evidence was overwhelming. The forged loans, the fake will, the bribery, and thanks to Daniel's brief attempt at paying off the debt, we had bank transactions linking Richard directly to the illegal money. His own stupidity sealed his fate. The courtroom was packed when the judge read the verdict. Guilty. Richard barely reacted. No yelling, no begging, just a cold, blank stare. As they let him out in handcuffs, he turned to us. You think this is over? He sneered. My father didn't even blink. Yes. And for the first time in my life, Richard had nothing left to say. Richard was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Daniel disappeared. Last we heard, he was working odd jobs in Florida, trying to stay out of the mess he helped create. The debt collectors backed off after law enforcement cracked down on their operation. And us? We finally moved on. It took time. The damage Richard left behind wasn't just legal. It was emotional. My father took it the hardest. Richard had been his brother, someone he once loved despite everything. One night, I found him in the living room, staring at an old photo of them as kids. Do you think he was always like this? He asked quietly. I sat down next to him. Maybe. Or maybe money just brought out who he really was. My father sighed. I should have cut him off years ago. I nodded. But now we finally did. He gave me a tired smile. And for the first time in years, I knew we were free. Some people think family means forgiveness no matter what. But sometimes, cutting ties is the only way to survive. And I have no regrets.